Welcome to the Blueprint Podcast, where we throw out the old blueprint so you can become who you were always meant to be. I'm your host, Jason Smith. And if you haven't already, make sure you click the subscribe button and share this podcast with your friends on social media and tag me in it at JBirdFit. Today, I have a very special guest for you, Dr. Judy Ho. Dr. Judy is a triple board certified and licensed clinical and forensic neuropsychologist and a tenured associate professor at Pepperdine University, television and podcast host, and published author. Dr. Judy conducts neuropsychological and psychodiagnostic evaluations, serves as an expert witness in legal cases, conducts clinical research, provides expert commentary to media, and is a sought-after public speaker. Dr. Judy, welcome to the Blueprint Podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me on, Jason. I'm excited to chat with you.
It's funny, and we just started talking about this, but I received an email from your publishing company. When I first saw it, I was like, what is this? Is this a scam? Why is somebody asking to give me a book? Why are you giving me a book? And so I got hit with like all this stuff, and I'm sitting there going through, I'm like catastrophizing, and it's such a simple email, right? Like, why would I think anything of that? But it's because I get inundated daily with things that like people want from me. Oh, let me help you for $25,000. Let me do this for you. And I'll do all your email marketing. When you get an email like that, I'm like, okay, they want to send me a book. I don't really want to give out my address. And I've never heard of this person. I had to go. And it's funny, right? Because we all start our journey at different places. And so for me, I started years ago, and you fall into things when you're supposed to, when you're open to receiving that information. So for me, this was serendipitous to get the book. It aligns with my content wonderfully, which for all you anxious attachers out there, this is a content warning for you. You're probably not going to love this podcast, but you're certainly going to learn a lot from it. So that was my first experience with you. Of course, I went to your social media right away, and then I listened to the episode of the podcast with you and Dr. Drew on your other book that's back here, Stop Self-Sabotage. And I was just like in love with everything that you're doing. Stop Self-Sabotage is like my life.
Nice.
I'm going through it. I'm just like, I'm at the dog park with my dog, and I'm tossing the ball and I'm listening to it. And I'm just like, that's me. And that's me too. And I'm like, damn it, Judy, stop.
I'm so glad to hear that it resonated. And
Yeah.
I feel like self-sabotage is such a universal phenomenon that we all do from time to time. So I'm glad to hear that you're saying, hey, you know what? This happens to me. And it happens to a lot of successful people. So it's not really
Right.
just, oh, I mess up all these areas of my life. That's not really how self-sabotage works. Most people who self-sabotage, 99% of the time, they're doing great at everything that they've planned for themselves. It's one or two areas where it's like,
Right.
how come I can't make more progress here? Or why do I get setbacks? And that's really what it's about.
Yeah, it's so interesting because we get to this place where it's like things are going well. And I like using fitness as the example because my whole life I was a gymnast and I was a wrestler. But then there was
Mhm.
that time period in my 20s where I wasn't really the best person like most everybody else. And you get away from fitness and you get away from those things. And now you're trying to get back into it and you're doing it. And again, you're doing well, you're back into an old routine, but you
Right.
stop yourself when you get to a certain point because it's just,
Mm.
I don't know that I deserve this. So I'm going to step back. This is uncomfortable. I've actually never been
Mhm.
past this point before. And
Right.
now I don't know what to do. So, what would you tell somebody who's going through that experience where they're just not sure what that next step looks like?
It's something that happens to all of us as humans. It's called the approach avoidance conflict. Essentially, the closer you get to that big prize, the more your biology and essentially evolution in many ways is holding you back a bit and say, hold on a minute, this is new territory. I've never been here before. I don't know how to manage this. Is this a bad thing? Is this scary? Should I be aware of something that I'm not aware of? It is normal for your brain to question those things. It is actually healthy for your brain to question those things. But you have to be able to move past it and say, no, novelty is how we grow. Novelty is how
Yes.
we as a species and as an individual can thrive. But of course, that feeling of discomfort, that's there because your body and your mind is saying, let's just make sure everything's okay. And that's normal. That's just part of being a human. It's like that balance, the dance of avoiding threat and attaining reward. But you don't want it to get so haywire that it's always about avoiding threat because then you lose sight of the prizes.
Yeah, it's really hard because so you grow up a certain way and you're very used to that. You're very conditioned to the things that you know that you're allowed to have in life. And you come up with this core belief system about the world and your place in it and the way it looks for you. And you might have this dream inside of you that you want to accomplish, and you have this burning desire, and it's something that you're capable of, but you don't have the evidence
Mhm.
for it necessarily in the past. And then you have all
Right.
these people in your life that it's like crabs in a bucket. They're always going to grab at your heels and try to keep you down at a certain level and say things like, "Oh, how's that little business going?" when you try to start a business or do something new. And then the
Yeah.
self-doubt creeps in, and then the imposter syndrome. And that's where I think a lot of
Exactly.
people tend to just, I give up, and then they go back to
Mhm.
living their life the way that they always have. And so they stop
Yeah.
themselves from actually becoming who they're supposed to be.
Yeah, exactly. That's such a good point. And I think that idea of holding back and slipping back into a comfortable space, in the beginning, it actually feels really relieving when you make that decision. Okay,
Yeah.
now I don't have to
Yes.
feel uncomfortable. I know how to do this. But then that feeling of discontent comes back again. It's about looking at what you could have achieved, or maybe even seeing the people around you start to surpass you in different ways. And you're like, oh, I could be there. Why am I not there? Then you go through the whole cycle again. But we have to break that cycle, right? You have to get past that feeling of I'm too afraid of the discomfort to push forward. So I just go back into a different kind of discomfort ultimately.
So how can we create awareness around that as an individual as we're experiencing it? Because we're going to be completely blind to it. How can
Right.
I recognize that's actually what's going on?
I think a lot of times if you check in with your values, and I love doing values work, especially for people who are super goal oriented. It's okay, yeah, values, whatever. I know what that means, or I heard a seminar about it. But really, people who are high achievers, oftentimes they just focus on goals. They focus on things that they can check off a list. But values are not those things. Values are things that if you really think about how you want to be remembered in this life, or the things that are truly important to you that you can't check off a list, but they're like the compass of your life. There's thousands of values, but some examples might be community, education, adventure, spirituality, integrity, what have you. If you really zero in on what your top two or three values are, and you ask yourself every day of my life, am I really living in concert with those values? Am I doing things that moves my life forward according to these directions? If you ask yourself that question and the answer is not a complete yes, or you're doubting that somehow, that probably means that you need to be able to go further. You need to push that past that discomfort, right? I think that's what the answer really is, really checking in with your values, recognizing when there is dissonance, and then saying, because I'm saying that these things are so important to me, then it's worth the discomfort. It's worth the self development work to push past that and to go forward.
What's an exercise that somebody could do to discover what their values really are?
Yeah, so you can Google values cards or values card store. I have also mine for free on my website at drjudyho.com. And essentially, you can go through a very nice hands-on exercise where you cut up these cards that have values names on it, and then you assemble them in order of priority. A lot of times people just don't have the time to really think about their values, or maybe all the values sound nice. It's okay, this sounds good, this sounds good. But when you're really forced to actually prioritize and you can only have five top ones, that really helps you to zero in on what is truly important for you. So I think that the hands on version, the values card sort, is really helpful, especially if you're a visceral learner. But if you wanted to do a really quick version of it, like I said, just Google values cards and you can get basically a list of the top values, the most common values. And then from there, you can just rank order them yourself. And then it's probably good to check in with your values every few weeks, maybe do it every month or two, because sometimes things shift. Things happen in our life. We have different priorities, and then our values might shift a little bit in order. And it's always good to keep those top of mind.
And then what does it look like when you're in the early stages of a relationship, but also when you're 10 years into your marriage as your values change? And so in that beginning stage of a relationship, you're comparing values, but
Mhm.
sometimes we dismiss those just so we can be with the person. So what would you
Yeah.
tell the person that does that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that sometimes early in the relationship, we get wrapped up in a lot of the excitement. And then
Yeah.
also earlier in relationships, we might be a different phase of our life than later on in the relationship. So your priorities are different. For example, maybe your sense of adventure when you're in your 20s or early 30s, it's going to be different from what you think adventure is when you're in your 40s or 50s. It's still the same value, but you might decide to live it out in different ways. So even that could change throughout the course of a relationship. And then I think in the beginning, you're in your honeymoon phase. You're like, I'm willing to try anything. Like, I'll take on your hobbies, no problem. And a year later, you're like, I really don't actually like this. So I think it is important to just keep that communication honest. I feel like so many people who come and see me for couples work or are experiencing issues in their relationship, the key is that they're just not communicating. And so most of the relationships that I've seen that I've worked with in my private practice, they die a slow death. So it's not really like an explosive death, like we have a huge argument and then that's it, goodbye. It's more of that disengagement over time,
Right.
not talking to each other, not being honest and saying, this is not what I want anymore, or I'm questioning what I want. And then people just stop talking to each other and then they stop connecting. And then one day they're just like, this relationship isn't working for me. And it's sad because I think if they had talked earlier in the relationship, either they wouldn't
Right.
waste each other's time or maybe they would have resolved those issues and they would still have a good relationship.
Yeah. I did all this for you and now I resent you.
Yeah, yeah, 10 years later,
10
you're
years
bringing
later.
it up from 10 years before. They're like, "I didn't even realize you were mad about that, and now we're
Yeah.
breaking up because of it." That's
That's
crazy.
somebody that has like a high pain threshold.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so they're just able to tolerate that for longer periods of time. It's so
Yeah,
interesting, especially in the beginning stages of a relationship. And with my content, I've really started to push, do you have a shared mission and vision? And
I like that.
are you using the language of that? Obviously, at 2 weeks into a relationship, you're not going to be coming up with a 1, 3, 5, and 10-year plan. But
Right,
you get into 12 months, 18 months, that's really a place where you want to get to where you can co-create with the other person. And you start asking yourself,
right.
what are we building? Why are we doing this?
Exactly.
Because if you're just in it to get something, then okay, what are you getting out of this then? And is
Right.
that sustainable over the next 50 years? And do you want to live like that?
Exactly. Yeah, there's a lot of different kinds of relationships. There are relationships that researchers like label as transactional relationships, and those are relationships where it's I'm getting something out of it. Maybe it's not love, but there's some kind of transaction going on. It's making sense for me. But like you said, are we really building something together? And over time, if something is truly transactional, it really affects your self concept.
Yeah.
It really affects your feeling of integrity, I think. And so I've definitely have had, people again that I've worked with in my practice who say I got into this relationship because really I needed financial security. This person provided that for me. And in the beginning it was great, but now it feels a little bit like my own agency is lost because I have to ask for finances. I have to ask for the money. I don't know how connected I am to this person except for that piece of it, and I'm
Right.
not satisfied in my relationship. And so again, it's not that they can't work completely, but it's just I have not really seen it truly work where people are saying I'm creating meaning in this relationship and this makes sense to me in the long run. It may have made sense for 2, 5 or even 10 years, but now in this phase of their relationship they're saying no and it doesn't make me feel good about myself.
So what made you write the new rules of attachment?
I wrote the new rules of attachment because I feel like everything goes back to our early bonds. And so after Stop Self-Sabotage, I got a lot of questions from a lot of readers who were like, what's next? I've done the work on Stop Self-Sabotage. I'm improving in this area. I feel good, but what's next? And to me, everything goes back to those early bonds because those early bonds is what creates our self-talk. Our
Yeah.
self-talk is like our brain's underlying computer program. It's running all the time in the background, organizing our thoughts and feelings and our behaviors, and it interprets the world and makes sense of what we see. And if you want to talk about the true roots of self-sabotage, it goes back to that self-talk. It goes back to those early bonds when we're just learning about the world and trying to understand what our role is in it and how people tend to respond when we reach out and when we say we have a need. And from there, we develop these templates and scripts and rules for life. And oftentimes they stick with us for way longer than they should because they were formed at a time when you're just learning everything. So you're like,
Right.
I guess this is how the world works forever.
Yeah.
But it's really not. And our brains are doing that because it's creating shortcuts of how to understand life, right? Like little things. You encounter a snake and you're like, I'm supposed to be afraid of that snake. So 10 years later, 30 years later, you try to avoid snakes. That's a great shortcut, right? You don't have to keep looking at the snake as if it's the first time you've seen it and be like, what should I do with this? It's no, you should avoid snakes. But some rules are not good. Some rules are not good, but your brain is just trying to economize. It's okay, where can we make these shortcuts so that our lives can be easier? And I think that it just makes some mistakes. It's not a perfect system.
I think we also hit this point where you're growing up and very early on, you're in this place of like joy, love, happiness, and then
Mhm.
life happens. and you,
Yes.
you have all these different experiences from your mom, your dad, your aunt, your uncle, your
Mhm.
caregiver, whoever's in your life, and that really
Right.
shapes the way that you see the world, and that becomes your normal. And then
Right.
you become 18, 19, 20 years old, and you're starting to enter into these relationships, and you don't realize that there's a
Mhm.
pattern associated with all of this. And for many of us, we make it into our 30s, 40s, 50s. I've had people as old as 70 do my 21-day self-love challenge, and they're just like, this is mind-blowing for me to come across this type of
Mhm.
information, because I feel like I'm
Mhm.
finally able to see myself.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
that's
but
so
that's what I
huge.
love. That's what I love that you're saying that there's all age ranges doing this work,
Yeah.
discovering things that are new, even into their 70s and saying, "Oh my gosh, this is my mind blown. Like, I did not know that I could conceptualize myself like this and still make progress." But that is such a hopeful message too, right? Like these
Right.
patterns do get stuck, but once you're willing to look at them, the work itself, once you start to do it, it's not as challenging as you might think. It's the monsters like underneath your bed when you're little. If you
Mhm.
don't look, it's really scary, but then once you look, you're like, "Oh, so all right, there might be a spider under there or maybe like an old stuffed animal I forgot, but it's definitely not what I thought it was," right?
Yeah, the
So,
the problem is it becomes like a glitch in the matrix, right?
yeah.
Because you're getting hit with all this information, and it's like when Agent Smith transforms into something else and you see the glitch, and I can't admit these things to myself. Like it's
Right.
way too hard for me to actually get to that place to be like, yeah, what I thought I knew actually isn't
Mhm.
necessarily true for me.
And I think that shift is so great when people can see it. It's like the
Yeah,
switch of, "Oh, this old idea about who I am, it's not working in my life, and also it's not true. Also, it's not
right,
true." You just take these things for granted, you just believe that they're true, and these are some of the things that do lead to self-sabotage, what we're talking about. People with insecure attachment, if you grew up with, again, adults, caregivers who were maybe a bit inconsistent or inattentive, or maybe didn't show up in the most helpful ways when you needed them, or maybe when you expressed the need, they seemed overwhelmed themselves or they try to shut it down, you're more likely to develop insecure attachment. And when that happens, you actually do question as you grow up whether or not you deserve good things, whether or not you can count on other people, whether or not you can have helpful, meaningful, symbiotic relationships. And even when you put your mind to it, if you're able to achieve the outcomes that you set out to do, insecure attachment, it affects how you feel about yourself at the core. And so I think in popular media, we see a lot of the applications to romantic relationships.
right,
Makes sense because it's okay, these develop from important relationships in childhood. What's most people's most important relationship in adulthood? Some kind of romantic partnership for most people. I get that translation, but it's such a limiting way of thinking about the impact of attachment because it seriously affects just like the core of you, everything. Yeah.
yeah. So I was a police officer for 8 years and had the
Oh,
opportunity
awesome.
to serve as crime scene. And this will
Mhm.
be a content warning for everybody that's listening. If you want to fast forward a little bit, you can. But doing that type of work for the time that I was able to do it, you get introduced to a lot of different circumstances that you wouldn't
Yeah.
normally see out in the real world. So these are
Mhm.
people have left the planet permanently, either at their own hand or by the hand of somebody else or
Yeah.
through natural causes. And what I realized over a period of time was the notes that get left behind, a lot of the times for the men, it's very small. There's not a lot of
Mhm.
information there. And it's something that I've done something so egregious that I can't overcome it,
Mhm.
or I'm not enough, I'm not good enough, I'm never going to be capable, and you'll be better off without me. And
Right.
so that's how the decision goes. And over time, you see this theme start to develop, and it's I'm not enough.
Mhm.
And then as you're going through it, you're like, I feel the same way. It's like your overlapping story on top of all this as you're taking in all the story from everybody else, from the circumstances. And if you have any ounce of empathy in you, you can't help but take a little bit of that on and feel the pain behind the struggle.
Right.
And then you get books like Attached, right? Because you're trying to figure out what's going on. And for me,
Yeah.
I went directly into this is attachment,
Mhm.
and I didn't have any background in that. I have a master's in threat and response management, which is
Mm.
natural disasters, man-made disasters, law enforcement, stuff like that. Nothing to do
Right.
with this. But you dive into this stuff because you recognize that this could be information that'll help you in the future be able to navigate these situations because you're trying to make
Yeah.
sense of these things that occur. And so when I saw your work and the way that you talk about attachment and that it's everywhere and it's in the workplace, it's in our relationships, it's in our
Mhm.
friendships, I wish more and more people could recognize that's this overlapping structure in our lives that's happening that we don't often talk about. But if you could see it, if you could
Mhm.
experience it, if you could embody it, then all of a sudden you'd really start to feel more like yourself and to be yourself and to allow others into your life enough to be able to see you for who you are because you accept you.
That's really comes down to is like how much self-acceptance there really is. But I appreciate you sharing your experience, and it's amazing that you served in that way as a police officer, but just like the things that you must have seen, and also this idea of threat management.
Yeah.
That I know that was like one of your specialty degrees and training areas, but that I think is like about humanity in general. Like threat assessment is what we're doing. That's what attachment bonds are
Right.
based on. It's why are we so cute as mammalian babies? Like we're cute because we have to be. Like if we're not cute, the
No,
adults
nobody's
would
going to
just
take
leave
care of you.
us. Are you kidding me? I know. I don't care like how good of a parent you are, how amazing and attentive. I know every single parent out there has had a thought where it's, man, if I could just have one day or 1 minute where I did not have to deal with somebody else's needs before my own, because that's what happens when you're a parent. You're constantly dealing with your child's needs before your own. But why do we do it? Because they're so cute. That's the only reason people stick around. And that's just how mammals are built. But
Right.
as a baby, you are very much your threat assessment is on all the time because you literally cannot survive by yourself. So if you can't keep your loved ones close, if they won't take care of you, you would not be here. So threat assessment happens from the first day of your life, and that's what attachment's all about. And can you feel safe and secure as a baby? That if you cry, your parents, some adult, somebody who cares about you is going to come. Those are why those lessons are so important, and it has to do with threat assessment throughout your life, right? So if in childhood you didn't get that feeling of security, as an adult, as you navigate through life, even though you have so much more agency, you're constantly feeling in fight or flight. I've had patients tell me that nothing's happening, but I just feel like something bad's going to happen, when that usually
Right.
goes back to some of their early experiences.
Yeah. It's that child that was, you get told that you were the quiet child.
Yeah.
Right, and it's not necessarily quiet, definitely living in my head,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so definitely lean avoidant when it comes to attachment styles, and I know you lean
Mhm.
avoidant as well.
Mhm.
What are the core 4 attachment styles, and why do different psychologists talk about it in different ways? Because I also heard it as attachment categories, and then we get
Uh-huh.
into anxious avoidant, dismissive avoidant, and all these subcategories, and
I know.
is it beneficial to do that?
Yeah, I feel like the research got super confusing and got way diluted, which is why I really try to set things straight as much as possible in my book. So,
Yeah.
in the original attachment literature, which started in the 50s and the 60s, there were four types. There were one secure type and three insecure types. But I think one of the issues with the early research is that they were very clear of the babies that showed secure attachment. They were very clear about the babies that showed anxious attachment and avoidant attachment. But then there was a whole category of babies, and it was a big category. It was like a quarter of the babies. So it wasn't like a small part, it's literally a quarter. It's like an equal part. They just didn't know how to categorize them because they acted in different ways. When the parent came back, and the whole attachment protocol, if you're not familiar, is basically they do this introduction and reunification process where you go into the lab with your primary caregiver. The primary caregiver plays with you, then like a stranger comes into the room, the primary caregiver leaves the room. The researchers look at how you deal with the stranger when your parent is not around, and then the parent comes back, and then the researcher looks at how you deal with your parent when they come back. They couldn't categorize very well this whole quarter of babies, and they just said these babies are disorganized, but it was all over the place. And so I think that's where the early attachment literature did a disservice, because then everybody else took it and ran with it, and they just made their own imprints on what that really is. So the most common thing that I've heard about the disorganized attachment, it's the most misunderstood one, is
Mhm.
that there's some kind of combination between anxious and avoidant. So I don't think that's true. I think that if you're a combination of anxious avoidant, then that's what you are. So sometimes people think I'm only one attachment style. No, I see most people have a combination. So some people are secure 80% of the time, but only in romantic relationships. They have avoidant attachment. Or some people have anxious attachment at work, but they have disorganized attachment in their friendships. So I think if you think that you're a combination of anxious and avoidant, that's what you are, and you're not disorganized. But that's like a big misconception in the pop psychology translation. Another big misconception is that people who are disorganized, they can't be helped. They have personality disorders. They're just like, it's like the worst type or something. And I don't
Right.
think it's the worst type, but I think it is important to say that a lot of people with disorganized attachment, they were under a lot of chronic stress as a baby. They probably did have some instances of trauma. So I think the work might be a little harder from the get-go, but that does not mean that you can't have secure attachment. So yeah, so I think that's why there's so much confusing literature out there because I think the translation just got lost at some point.
Another thing that happens, and you see this in my comment section, I'm sure you see it in yours as well, is there's this anger from the anxious attacher towards the avoidant and this
Oh
resentment
yeah.
that exists. And it's just like, people, what are we doing? Like, they are human beings. They are not narcissists, although they can have narcissistic tendencies. But we've gotten to this place of all this labeling. And
Mm.
what is something that we can do to start to combat the labeling?
Yeah. Okay. So our human brains, we love to categorize. Again, it's that
All right.
shortcut. The whole idea of, oh, if I can make something more efficient, then I will. And it's sometimes automatic, right? But we have to fight that by trying to not make something more simple than it really should be. Sometimes it is great to keep it simple. Other times you got to take everything in with context. And I find that when there's a lot of anger going towards another type, it's really about a lack of self compassion because when you have anger towards somebody else's behaviors, usually, if you just slow down and you're willing to do that self-examination, there's something that's triggering that is really about yourself. It might be a trait that you wish you had, so there's like a jealousy behind it, and that's why you're so upset. Or it's a trait that you have and you don't like it in yourself. So when you see it in somebody else, you really push against it. So
Uh,
those are the most common reasons why we get so angry. We want to label people and we want to write them off. But a lot of times it goes back to your own compassion toward yourself. If you truly accepted yourself, you wouldn't have so much anger towards somebody else because part of that is blaming somebody else for your problem. So if an anxiously attached person hates the avoidantly attached person, it's because at some point they felt rejected by an avoidantly attached person.
Right.
And anxious and avoidant attachment relationships are one of the most common. I think it's because both are trying to resolve something that happened in their childhood. They're trying to get a different outcome, but they keep running it the same program with the same people that might
Yeah,
have caused
they're
them
really
stress in
good
the
at
first
keeping
place.
that pattern going.
Yeah, exactly. Just
Yeah.
keep the yeah, that whole push-pull pattern in a relationship, right? Which maybe at first sounds exciting, but after a while, it's not exciting. It's just terrible and chaotic. But I think that's really where it comes from. And so if you're able to just slow down and have more self-compassion, and one of my favorite ways of practicing this is the loving kindness meditation. If you haven't been privy to this, it's an awesome exercise. Essentially, you do a very short visualization, visualizing yourself sending love and compassion to somebody you care about, then somebody you're in conflict with, and finally yourself. And there's a lot of scripts for this. You can just Google a script for loving kindness meditation. I have a version of it on my Instagram and takes 5 minutes. But if you can practice this on a daily basis, I think that you're going to see a lot more movement in that idea of finding yourself being angry and then who are you hurting except for yourself when you have anger like that?
You talk a lot about, attachment in the workplace,
Yeah.
and I have a anecdotal story. In my 20s, I worked as a chef, and I would be in the office doing invoicing,
Mhm.
and somebody would walk in, and I wouldn't turn around, and I would just keep doing the
Mhm.
invoicing.
Mhm.
They would get upset with that, like, "Why are you
Mhm.
not acknowledging me? Why aren't you turning around?" I'm
Yeah.
like, "I heard you. I know that you're
Yeah.
here. What can I do for you? Do I need to stop what I'm
Mhm.
doing right now just to acknowledge you?" And the answer is yes, you should.
Yeah.
But you're so like
Hmm.
tuned out from that process, you don't even know what's happening. And so then you take offense to it and you're just like, why are you giving me a hard time over this? I'm just doing my job.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
you know what? I've done that many times. I probably still do it sometimes. And because when I'm zeroed in on a task, I just want to do it.
Right.
But I've definitely understood just the communication styles of all the different types. Like we've talked about, we both lean a little avoidant at times. And I've had to really be cognizant, especially of people I work with constantly, their attachment styles. There's some people who they're like me, they love to get down to business right away. Like, it's not a problem. We don't have to have niceties necessarily on a busy day. And then there are some people that if I don't engage them in just casual conversation for 5 to 10 minutes for the first part of our meeting, it's not going to be a good meeting. So everybody has different needs based on maybe their programming, and we have to be more understanding of that. But yeah, I've definitely had so many times, Jason, where I'm in the middle of something and somebody walks in, "Can I ask you a question?" I'm like, "No, but I guess yes." But yeah, I find
You're
myself getting
here. So
irritated. I know you already showed up, so I guess we're gonna talk about it now. But I do. I'm like, okay, you know what? They don't know that you're in the middle of a zone. Whatever, it's okay. Let's just take a deep breath.
yeah, it's like
So
put a
yeah,
sign on the door, in the flow. Let me be in the flow for the next
yeah,
30 minutes. Yeah.
exactly.
So if we're looking to heal our insecure attachment style, what is really the basis of being able to do that?
Yeah. So I think, again, if I didn't believe that the work was possible, then I would not have written this book. And I think that all of us, this is not about blaming your parents, by the way. This is not your license to go and show your parents this podcast, be like, you ruined my life. That's not 99% of parents are really trying to do their best with what they've got. And they're not perfect and they've got their own emotional baggage and issues. Of course, there's that 1% of horrible parents that are truly just abusing their kids on purpose, knowing that they're doing it and they just don't care. But in general, your parents did the best with what they've gotten. So it's not really about going back into the past and blaming them, but it's really about taking a look at where your life is, where you want to go, and then providing that secure attachment to yourself. This is something that has been a buzzword in pop psychology too, and I feel like it got people get really into it, then it gets a bad name because people are like, "Oh, inner child work. That sounds like some woohoo, like crystal BS." And I would say that I was
It
probably
can
one of
be.
those you can be.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that some people, the way they talk about it can be, but I would say that I'm one of those people who prior to maybe the last few years, I would have said, "Oh, inner child work," and maybe laughed. And now I'm a true believer because we all have that metaphorical little us that's living inside us, and it has some unmet needs and it has some desires and interests and goals and dreams for itself. And your adult self, who has so much more agency than your child self, who had to rely on everybody around them, your adult self is the best model for a secure attachment relationship. So if your adult self can attend to your metaphorical little you and learn to listen to that and hone your intuition, that's the beginning of secure attachment basis and secure attachment work. Once you have a more secure attachment within yourself, that's when you can start living out secure attachment patterns in all the other areas of your life.
So then what's the difference between self-image and ideal self?
Yeah, self image is what you think other people see you as. So it's like your own perception of what's being reflected in the social world right now. So you may think people probably see me as an outgoing person. People probably see me as a funny person. Whether or not that's a realistic self-image, that's like a whole other story. Some people are much better with perceiving themselves accurately, and some people are not. And that also has to do somewhat with attachment. People may say, "You're amazing, you're wonderful," but then your own self-image is they're just saying that to
No, I
play
can't
hate
take
me.
that compliment. I hate
Right.
myself. Leave me alone.
Exactly. Ideal self is like the image of the person that you want to be and that you think you could be, that you aspire to be, that it's like your optimized version of yourself. For most people, they never believe that they're achievable. For most people, they don't think that the two can align. But you can align the two. And I think that if you were able to align the two, you'd feel a lot better about yourself on a daily basis.
I totally agree. Another thing that I've noticed in my coaching is I started a men's coaching group recently.
Mhm.
They seem to be identifying more and more with an anxious attachment.
Mm,
I know historically, men, according to the literature in the past, tend to
yeah.
be more avoidant. However,
Yes.
with shifts in society and the advent of
Yes.
social media and all this other stuff that's going on socially, I can
Mhm.
now see how that would occur and why you would think that you are because they're taking the test. I tell them to go take your test and they do. And they come back and they're like, "Yeah, it's anxious." And so how can we help men navigate an anxious attachment style? And is it just the same for everybody, or do we need to
Mhm.
genderize it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think you're right. The reason why, probably in the past, we've seen more males saying that we have avoidant attachment is because of cultural expectations, right? In general, males were expected to be a little bit more stoic, at least compared to females. They're not really expected to talk about their emotions. Like, that's not really their role, right? And avoidantly attached people tend to be more uncomfortable with emotional intimacy and deeper conversations about feelings. So it's aligned. It makes sense. That's how they learn to cope. And probably they got those lessons from their parents, right? If you grew up with in a child in a household where there was a boy and a girl in the family, you could see that some of these differences of how the parent was talking to you about how to cope. If it's a girl, they're crying, it's okay. But if it's a boy that's crying, oftentimes parents like, stop crying, don't be such
Yeah.
a baby, or
You'll
don't
be
be such a
fine.
girl. Yeah, so I get that. Anxious attachment, I think in males, a couple of considerations. One is I think that there's people are just talking about it more now. I do think that was still happening, but obviously it was just a little bit more under the radar. But I think if you have an anxious attachment as a male, it's not necessarily about, oh, I'm too emotional. That's actually not what anxious attachment is about. So I think just dispelling those notions, right? It's not about you being more like a girl, or it's not about you being super emotional. It's actually just about the fact that you derive your reinforcement from outside sources.
Right.
So, avoidantly attached people tend to overly derive their source of satisfaction in themselves through achievements that don't necessarily have to do with people. Anxiously attached people derive their self satisfaction from connecting with other people, hearing from other people how they're doing, wanting that reinforcement more than the average person. So that's really the goal of trying to balance that out. Of course, it's nice to get reinforcement. We all want it. We live in a social world. We have to have that. But when you don't have that reinforcement, can you still feel good about yourself?
Yeah.
Can you still self initiate if no one tells you that's the right thing to do? Because deep in your mind and in your intuition, that is the right thing to do. So it's really about honing your ability to self actualize and to make decisions confidently, even when you don't have social input.
Do you ever talk about nice guy syndrome?
I have talked about nice guy syndrome, not in
So
a while, but yeah, tell me what you've been talking about.
since starting a men's group and going on my own journey and reading all these books, you get The Way of the Superior Man by David Dita. You get No More
Mm.
Mr. Nice Guy by Dr. Robert Glover. He's coming on the podcast in the next
Oh,
couple weeks.
nice.
And then you get other people. Jack Davenport is another one that has some really good books. And you just find yourself trying to discover masculinity and what that looks like. And we've got so many people in all these different flavors trying to redefine it and change it and manipulate it and turn it into something different. And for me, it's I like simple. Simple really works for me. So when I hear nice guy, and then you
Mhm.
start seeing people with an anxious attachment style, and then you overlap those two things, they really seem to go together. And so it makes more
Yes.
sense. That's what's happening. And so
Mhm.
we like the terminology, oh, he's a nice guy.
Yeah.
And that doesn't feel good. That's manipulation. And so yeah,
Yeah.
that's what a anxious attacher kind of
Yeah.
does.
Yeah,
Right.
they're always rescuing people.
Right.
They're more prone to codependency. They put other people's needs before themselves because one, they really do want to help, but two, that's how they derive feeling good about themselves. Somehow
Right.
in their childhood, they've cemented a belief that unless you're doing things for others, you're not going to get cared for. So there's a transactional quality to it, although I also believe that a lot of them really truly want to help. But guess what? Nice guys burn out too. You can't
Right.
do that forever. You are going to have resentment underneath. You're going to feel like, I don't love the fact that I'm always doing things for you. And when push comes to shove, are you actually really even going to be there for me? That's a terrible thing to have to hold in your mind all the time. And then if you're not meeting your own needs, at some point, you will experience burnout. And that's going to result in physical and mental health negative outcomes for you. And then you're not going to be able to do things to be the nice guy anymore anyway. So it's this idea of almost even trying to change that narrative of you can be a nice guy but still have good boundaries. You can be a nice guy without being codependent. And unless you're willing to test that a little bit and hold your boundaries and see if people are going to stick around, you're never going to be able to dispel that negative idea about yourself that nobody's going to stick around if you don't do XYZ for them. And really, the people you truly want to stick around are the people who are going to say, I respect your boundaries and I'm still going to be here for you. So it's a
Right.
good way to weed out people who probably shouldn't be in your life. I feel like as I've gotten older, that's something that I've really not necessarily even consciously did, but it's just, wow, if this person's not serving like a function, helping me create meaning, I don't have to keep talking to them just because we
Right.
were talking for 10 years or because we're historical friends. I still appreciate their role in my life at an earlier time. It doesn't mean you're throwing out the baby with the bathwater, but it's also okay to not engage those individuals who aren't making you feel good.
I think that's a really hard thing to do for the people that have been in your life historically, to be able to step
Yeah,
back, zoom out, and actually evaluate that relationship and to
right.
see the benefit that's coming from that, or if it's actually, again, crabs in a bucket, it's pulling you down and keeping you small,
Yes.
and it's stopping you from doing the things that you know that you're capable of doing.
Yeah, that can be really hard. And I think that there may be some guilt associated with, I'm not talking to this person. Is that okay? And I'm not talking about cutting people out of your life completely. There are people
Right.
in my life who I just don't talk to as often, but I still talk to them sometimes. It's not like I don't ever want to talk to you anymore, but it's more, do I need to engage this person on a regular basis? Probably not. I don't really don't think that's the phase that we're in right now.
Yeah, they're the 5th day person, right? So it's like when I get a text message, I'll text you back in about 5 days, right?
I love that. Oh my gosh. Okay. Don't use that rule for me. If anybody of my friends who's listening, I'm terrible at getting back to
I'm
people with
horrible.
text. But no,
Yeah,
I like that. I like that. I don't know how some people do it. I know some super busy people, and the minute I text them, it's they just text me back. And it's not because I'm important. They do that to everybody. I know that's how they are. I'm terrible with text. Like literally
yeah.
there'll be like a whole week that goes by and I'll be like, "Oh my gosh, I'm sorry I missed this text. I still love you. So sorry." So if you're anxiously attached, it's probably a little hard to be friends with me sometimes.
No, for sure. So for me, there's a limit with texting, and it's I've got my
Yeah.
computer set up, and it's like the messages come through, and if I have a
Yeah.
second, I'll respond real quick, and so I can be quick on the response, but other times you get overwhelmed, and it's, "Okay, we've
Yes.
already had 10 messages within a
I know.
24-hour period, so I'm tapped out on
Yeah.
messaging right now."
Yeah.
And so let's talk about that real quick in terms because the anxious attacher, this is really I come from the era of the late 1900s where we had
Yep.
pagers. Not everybody did, but some of us did. And you got to put a quarter in, and then it turned into 50 cents and ultimately 75 cents at some point. But so that grew really quick inflation. But that's the way you would communicate. And so you had to go home and actually think about the other person. And you didn't
Mhm.
have all this access that we have today. And so now that's completely changed, but it's turned into I have all this access to you all the time, and now you have to respond to
Mhm.
me
Oh, the
with the
worst.
expectation that I have of you because we're in a relationship, and
Yeah.
it's not. So can you speak a
Yeah.
little bit more on that?
Yeah, I get that a lot. I get people who email me, then they text me, and then they call me, but it's all within an hour. But I think, like you said, like the advent of technology just makes you think that you're supposed to be always by some form of technological communication. But there's times where I'm just not doing that because I'm in the middle of something else and I'm really trying to focus on that thing. And people just don't understand that. So I think that's even a boundary that sometimes you have to set with people, but be honest about it right away. Hey, sometimes it might take me a little bit longer to respond. I will get to you by the end of the day. If it's truly an emergency, then call me. But don't call me, email me, and text me all within 30 minutes just because you're anxious that I haven't looked at my email in 20 minutes, which happens all the time, at least in my workday. I mean, I try to go only into my emails a few times a day as opposed to having it up all the time because I notice myself getting pulled to I want to respond right now, but some emails take 20 minutes to respond. And I can't tell you
Oh,
how many times
yeah.
I've opened an email 5 times because I'm like, I don't have 20 minutes right now. So that's obviously not a very efficient way to do your emailing. Don't ask me about email productivity because I'm not the person. But I notice myself getting pulled by the messages if they come in if I don't shut off the notification. So I think if there are people in your relationship who pull for a different kind of communication from you, then you just have to tell them, like, this is how I'm working, but give them a way to access you if it's truly urgent, right? But then just let them know, you know what? Sometimes I might not respond for a few hours, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to get to you soon.
I think it's interesting because we hit these milestones in relationships where it's 3 months,
Yeah.
6 months, 9 months, 12 months, and there's, like, this increase in activity with text messaging and this expectation from the anxious attacher that you're going to give this to me, and I gotta have this, otherwise
Yep.
I don't feel connected to you, and
Right.
so I need that connection, and it's okay. So what I've been telling people is when you recognize that inside yourself, go into your breath,
Mhm.
go into your body, use a pattern interrupt, allow yourself to just stop for a second, time out,
Right.
pause,
Right.
and say, "What am I going through right now?" And
Mhm.
it's halt, right? Hungry, angry,
Right.
lonely, tired, bored. What is it? What need are you trying to get met right now? And there's so much
Exactly.
resistance to that
Mhm.
because I just want them to text me. I want to communicate with them, and it's they have a job, and
Right.
they're working their job, and every
Right.
time they get pulled away from that to message you, it's impacting their life and the way that they operate in the world. And
Yep.
to me, that seems unfair to do that to somebody, especially when you're going to see them in 12 hours.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's where I know that they're fighting it, but when you're fighting something the most, that means you need it the most.
Yeah.
So learning to self-soothe is huge. And it's so great because you don't need to wait for somebody to do that for you. That's the whole point of reparenting work. It's not that you don't want that reinforcement, and you will get that reinforcement, but sometimes you can give it to yourself, right? And it should feel just as good, if not better, coming from you as opposed to that person that you're in a relationship with. That's the kind of goal that reparenting work should achieve if you're able to, at least willing to dip your toe into the process.
Dr. Judy, thank you so much for being here today. Tell everybody how to reach out to you and get your new book, The New Rules of Attachment.
Thanks so much for all the insightful questions. I learned a lot from you as well, Jason. You guys can find me on social media at Dr. Judy Ho. Instagram is my primary platform, but I'm on all the platforms. And then you can get free resources at my website, drjudyho.com. And if you sign up for my newsletter, I also give free resources through that as well.
And if you guys haven't taken Dr. Judy's attachment test, I highly suggest that you do it, and definitely go get the book, The New Rules of Attachment. Thank you for listening to the Blueprint Podcast. We hope today's conversation is giving you insights and strategies to help you build a better relationship with yourself. If you found value in today's episode, please take a moment to rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback not only helps us grow, but enables us to reach and inspire more listeners just like you. If you're ready to take a transformative step towards self-acceptance and love, we invite you to join the 21-day self-love challenge. It's a carefully curated journey designed to help you connect with yourself on a deeper level, embrace your uniqueness, and cultivate a lasting practice of self-love and care. To sign up, simply visit our Stand store, link in bio, and take the first steps towards a more loving and compassionate relationship with yourself. Thank you for tuning in and being a part of the Blueprint community. Remember, the journey to self-discovery and personal growth is ongoing, and we're here to guide you every step of the way. Until next time, keep building your blueprint for your life's vision.